Welcome to the Oracle's Rest, a place where stories unfold slowly, where time softens, and where the mind is free to wander. Tonight, we drift back along the Nile into the mythology of ancient Egypt. Tonight is a night of gods and boats and rivers, of a sun that sails across the sky in a wooden bark and sinks each evening into a country beneath the world, of a goddess whose body is the night itself, arched above the earth, swallowing the sun at dusk and giving birth to it again at dawn, of a feather so light that a human heart was weighed against it. For more than 3,000 years, the people who lived beside the Nile told these stories, not once, and not in one fixed form, but continuously, in temples and tombs and painted coffins, in whispered household prayers, on papyrus rolls and carved stone walls. The stories changed as they travelled. Different cities told them differently. Priests in one place said the world began one way, and priests 100 miles upriver said it began another, and both versions were kept, and neither was erased. Egyptian mythology was never a single book. It was a river, gathering everything it passed. So let us move slowly through it, not in order, exactly. Rivers do not move in order. In the beginning, the Egyptians said, there was no sky and no ground. There was only water. They called it none, and it was not an ocean in the way we imagine oceans. It was dark, and it was still, and it had no shore and no surface and no direction. It was formless, and it was endless, and it had always been there. And out of that dark water, a mound of earth rose. This was the first place, the first solid thing. The Egyptians called it the primeval mound, and it mattered enormously to them because they watched it happen every single year. Each summer, the Nile flooded and covered the fields, and each autumn, the waters drew back. And as they drew back, small islands of dark silt emerged from the surface of the flood, land appearing out of water. Creation repeating itself annually in front of everyone. At Heliopolis, the city the Egyptians called Unu, that first mound was remembered by a single standing stone. They called it the Ben. It was a tapering block, wider at the base and rising to a point, and it was said to be the very place the first light touched. every obelisk ever raised. In Egypt is a tall, thin descendant of that stone, and the small capping pyramid. At the summit of an obelisk is still called a pyramidion, and the tip of a true pyramid is the same shape for the same reason. The Egyptians were building the first morning over and over in granite on that first mound, according to the priests of Heliopolis. A god named Atum brought himself into being. He was not made by anything else. He simply was, and then he was aware, and then he was alone. And being alone, he created from himself, without a partner. He brought forth 2 children, Shu, who was air and dryness and empty space, and Tefnut, who was moisture, the first separation, the first distinction between one thing and another thing. That is the Heliopolitan account. But go a little way upriver to Hermopolis, and the priests there told it differently, and they were not considered wrong. At Hermopolis they spoke of the Ogdoad, 8 gods, in 4 pairs, 4 male and 4 female, and they existed inside the dark water before anything else, Nun and Naunet, who were the water itself, Her and Hauhet, who were endlessness, Kek and Karket, who were darkness, and Amun and Amunet, who were hiddenness, the quality of being concealed. The males were drawn with the heads of frogs, the females with the heads of serpents, both creatures that live at the muddy edge where water meets land, and both of which appear suddenly in great numbers when the flood recedes. These 8 moved together in the dark, and out of their movement something came. In one version, an egg resting on the mound. In another, a lotus flower rising and opening on the surface of the water, and inside it a child, and the child was the sun, opening his eyes for the first time. The lotus mattered because of what it does. The blue lotus of the Nile closes at dusk, sinks beneath the surface, and rises and opens again in the morning. The Egyptians watched a flower perform the journey of the sun every day, at eye level, in the shallows, and at Memphis they told it a 3rd way, and that version we will come to. Here is the thing worth holding on to. None of these accounts cancelled the others. Egyptian religion did not work by choosing a god could be one thing here and something else there, and could merge with another god without either of them being diminished, and separate again afterward. Amun and Ra combined into Amun-Ra, and both continued to exist independently. Ra and Horus combined into Ra-Horakhti. Ptah and Sokar and Osiris merged into a single funerary deity with 3 names. This was not confusion. It was a way of thinking that had room for a thing to be true in more than one form at once. There are over 1,000 named deities known from Egyptian sources. Some have entire temples and 3,000 years of hymns. Some appear once on one wall and are never mentioned again. Shu and Tefnut had children of their own. Geb, the earth, and Nut, the sky. And here the Egyptians did something that many people find surprising when they first encounter it, because in Egypt the earth was male and the sky was female, which reverses the arrangement found in a great many other traditions. Geb lay below, Nut arched above him, her fingertips and toes touching the horizons, her long body curved across the whole of the world. And they were pressed together, earth and sky, with no room between them for anything to live. So Shu, their father, the god of air, stepped into the gap and lifted Nut upward and held her there. He is shown in painting after painting with his arms raised, standing on the body of the earth, holding the sky above his head, the air between the ground and the stars, doing the work of keeping them apart. That gap is where everything else happens. Every field, every reed, every heron, every person who ever lived, all of it in the space held open by one God with his arms up. Nut's body was covered in stars. In tomb paintings, she is drawn stretched across the ceiling, dark blue, her skin scattered with small golden points. And at one end of her, the sun is being swallowed. And at the other end, the sun is being born. Every evening, she took the sun into her mouth. All night it travelled through her body. Every morning she gave birth to it at the eastern horizon, and the red of the dawn sky was said to be the blood of that birth. She did this every day, forever, without rest. Sometimes she is not a woman at all, but a cow, enormous, standing over the world with her legs at the 4 corners and her belly full of stars. In that form, she is close to Mehet Weret, the great flood, the celestial cow, whose name means something like the great swimmer, and the sun sails along her belly as though along a river, because that is the other way the Egyptians pictured the sky, not as empty air, but as water. A great river up there, matching the one down here, and the sun crossing it in a boat exactly as a person would cross the Nile to reach the western bank. And at the two ends of the world stood Aka, who is drawn as two lions seated back to back, facing away from one another, one looking east and one looking west, with the horizon between them. The sun passed between the lions going down at night, and passed between them again. Coming up, Aka guarded that threshold, and the earth itself was his body. Nut and Geb had children too, and the story of how those children came to be born is one of the strangest and most charming in all of Egyptian myth, in a version recorded much later by a Greek writer. Nut had been forbidden to give birth on any day of the year. The year had 360 days, and every one of them was closed to her. So Thoth, the god of wisdom and writing and the moon, went and played a board game with the moon itself. The game was senet, which the Egyptians genuinely played on long, narrow boards of 30 squares, and which was buried with them so they could keep playing afterward. Thoth won, and what he won was a small portion of the moon's light, enough to make 5 additional days. 5 days that belonged to no year. 5 days outside the calendar, where the rule did not apply. And on those 5 days, Nut gave birth to Osiris and to Isis and to Set and to Nephthys. The Egyptian civil calendar really did work this way. 360 days in 12 months of 30. And then 5 days appended at the end, standing outside the ordinary count. They were considered dangerous days, unlucky days. Days when the ordinary order thinned. But they were also the birthdays of the gods, and they were celebrated. Osiris became king of Egypt, and he was a good king. The stories agree on this. He taught people to farm, to plant grain and harvest it, to make bread and beer, to live in settled places and honor the gods. Under him, the land was green and orderly and calm. His brother Set watched all of this. Set is one of the most complicated figures in Egyptian religion, and it is worth being careful with him. He was the god of the desert. of storms, of foreign lands, of chaos and disruption and violent weather. He was depicted as an animal that no one has ever been able to identify with certainty, with a long curved snout and tall square-tipped ears, and scholars still call it simply the Set animal. He was not purely evil. For long stretches of Egyptian history, he was worshipped, honored, and named in royal titles. But in the great story, he is the one who breaks things. Set built a chest, a beautiful one, decorated and finely made. And he built it precisely to the measurements of his brother's body, though he told no one that. At a banquet, he brought it out and offered it as a gift to whoever it fitted. The guests climbed in one by one, and none of them fitted, because it had not been made for them. And then Osiris climbed in, and it fitted him exactly, because it had been made for nothing else. And Set slammed the lid and sealed it, and threw it into the Nile. The river carried the chest away, down through the delta, out into the sea. And here the story becomes a story about searching. Isis, the wife of Osiris, went looking. She walked. She asked. She followed rumors from town to town, and the accounts describe her moving through the world in mourning, in ordinary clothes, unrecognized, asking children if they had seen anything, because in Egyptian belief, children sometimes saw what adults could not. The chest, in one telling, had washed ashore at Byblos on the coast of Lebanon, and a tamarisk tree had grown around it, enclosing it entirely inside the trunk. And the tree had grown so fine and so fragrant that the local king cut it down and used it as a pillar in his palace, without ever knowing what was inside it. So, there is a moment in this story where a dead god is standing in a foreign palace, holding up a roof, and nobody knows. Isis came to Byblos. She sat by a well. She was taken into the household, and eventually she asked for the pillar, and it was given to her. And she cut the chest out of the wood and carried her husband home. But Set was not finished. He found the body, and he tore it into pieces, and he scattered the pieces the length of Egypt. Later accounts give the number as 14, though the sources vary, and the number should be held loosely. Isis set out again. She searched the whole country, riverbank by riverbank, marsh by marsh, and where she found a piece, she is sometimes said to have raised a shrine, which is one of the ways Egyptians explained why so many different places claimed to hold the tomb of Osiris. She found every part but one, which had fallen into the river and been eaten by a fish, and still she managed what she had set out to do. With her sister Nephthys beside her, and with the help of Anubis and Thoth, she bound the body together with linen. That binding is the first mummy, and it is the reason mummification existed at all. Egyptians did not wrap their dead out of squeamishness or superstition. They were repeating an act performed by a goddess for someone she loved, and they believed that repeating it correctly produced the same result. Isis then transformed herself into a kite, a small, sharp-winged falcon, and beat her wings above the body and breathed life into it long enough to conceive a son. That son was Horus. She hid him in the marshes of the delta, in a thicket of papyrus at a place called Chemis, and raised him in secret, because Set would have killed him. The image of Isis in the reeds with the infant Horus became one of the most reproduced images in the ancient world. She is shown seated, holding him on her lap, feeding him. Thousands of small bronze statuettes of this survive. Horus grew up, and when he was grown, he went to claim his father's throne. What followed is called the contendings of Horus and Set, and it lasted, in one papyrus account, for 80 years. It was not primarily a war. It was a lawsuit. The two of them appeared before a tribunal of gods and argued, and the tribunal deliberated and deliberated and could not decide, and adjourned and reconvened, and still could not decide. There are letters sent. There is a moment when the assembled gods write to the goddess Ninth to ask her opinion, and she replies, essentially, that the answer is obvious and they should stop wasting her time. There are contests. In one, the two agree to race boats made of stone. Set carves his boat from an actual mountain peak, and it sinks immediately. Horus builds his from cedar wood and covers it in plaster so that it merely looks like stone, and it floats. And he wins by cheating. And this is told approvingly. At some point in the struggle, Horus lost an eye. Set tore it out, and Thoth, or in some versions Hathor, healed it and restored it. And that restored eye became the Wedjat, the Eye of Horus, one of the most widely worn protective symbols in Egyptian history. It is painted on coffins. It is set into rings. It is the thing that has been made whole again after being damaged, which is exactly why people wanted it near them. Horus, it should be said, is not one god so much as a family of them, and the Egyptians were entirely comfortable with that. There is Horus the child, shown naked with a side lock of hair, one finger raised to his lips, which is simply how Egyptian art indicated a child. Greek visitors saw that gesture, misread it as a sign for silence, and turned him into a god of secrets. There is Horus the Elder, a sky god older than the Osiris story, whose right eye was the sun and whose left eye was the moon, so that the phases of the moon were the wound and its healing. There is Horus of the two horizons, joined with the sun as Ra Horakti. And there is Horus of Betet, who appears above temple doorways all over Egypt as a sun disk with outspread wings, so that everyone entering passes under a pair of wings. The Great Sphinx at Giza was understood in later periods as one of these. Horus in the horizon, a lion body with a human face lying. At the desert edge, looking directly east into the sunrise, a stone slab still stands between its paws, recording a dream in which the buried Sphinx spoke to a young prince, promised him the throne if he cleared away the sand, and got what it asked for. The living king wore Horus on his own body. At the front of the royal headdress rose a cobra, hood spread, called the Uraeus, and she was the eye of Ra placed on the brow, facing forward, ready to spit fire at whatever approached. Beside her, in the fullest form of the crown, was a vulture. The two of them together were called the Two Ladies, Wajet, the cobra of the north, and Nekbet, the vulture of the south, the two halves of the country worn on one forehead. In the end, the tribunal ruled for Horus. He became king of the living. Osiris, who could not return to the world of the living, became king of the dead instead, and ruler of the underworld. And every pharaoh who died afterward became an Osiris, and every pharaoh who lived was a Horus. The myth was not simply a story about gods. It was the constitutional theory of the Egyptian state, and it held for 3,000 years. Set was not destroyed. He was given the deserts, and the storms, and in many periods a position on the solar boat where his violence was useful. Osiris, meanwhile, became something more than a dead king. He became grain. This is one of the loveliest ideas in Egyptian religion, and it is entirely literal. Osiris was buried, and out of his burial came life. And the Egyptians saw the same thing happen in every field, every year. Seed goes into dark ground, nothing for a while, then green. So they made what are now called Osiris beds, a shallow wooden tray cut in the outline of the god, filled with Nile silt, sown with barley, watered, and left in the darkness of the tomb. The grain germinated, and there, sealed in a burial chamber, was the shape of Osiris turning green, growing a coat of pale shoots in the dark. Several of these survive. One was found in the tomb of Tutankhamun. That is why Osiris is painted with green skin in some scenes, the colour of new growth, and with black skin in others, the colour of the wet silt the flood leaves behind. Black was not a colour of death to the Egyptians. It was the colour of the fertile land. They called their own country Kemet, the black land, and the desert beyond it, Deshret, the red land. And those two words describe the whole geography of Egypt. A thin ribbon of dark soil, and on either side of it, nothing. His symbol was the Djed pillar, a column with 4 horizontal bars near the top, understood as the backbone of Osiris, and meaning stability, endurance, the thing that holds upright. At certain festivals, a great Djed pillar was physically raised, from lying down to standing, hauled upright with ropes by the king and priests together. And the raising of it was the resurrection, acted out in front of a crowd. Isis had her own knot, the Tayet, a looped sign often carved in red jasper and placed on mummies, and the two symbols were frequently paired along the sides of coffins. One column of stability, one of protection, running down toward the feet, Abydos, in the south, was believed to hold the tomb of Osiris, and it became the great place of pilgrimage. People who could not be buried there arranged for small memorial stones to be set up nearby instead, so as to be present in some form. And each year a procession carried the image of the god out from the temple, and the story of his death and mourning and vindication was performed in the open along the desert edge, watched by pilgrims. It is among the earliest recorded religious drama anywhere. Isis outlived them all. Her worship spread out of Egypt entirely, carried by traders and soldiers, and temples to her were built across the Mediterranean world, and as far as the cold northern edge of the Roman Empire, on the island of Philae, at the southern boundary of Egypt. Her temple stayed open long after the rest had closed. The last dated inscription written in hieroglyphs anywhere in the world was carved there in the late 4th century of our era, more than 3,000 years after the earliest ones. And then the language of the god was not written again for 1400 years, until a young Frenchman with a copy of a broken stone worked out how to read it, because there was something out there that needed fighting. Let us follow the sun. The Egyptians said that the sun travelled in a boat. This is not a metaphor they used occasionally. It is the central image of their cosmology, and it comes from the plainest fact of their daily lives, which is that in Egypt you travelled by river. Roads were secondary. The Nile ran the length of the country. The current carried you north. The prevailing wind carried you south. And so a boat was simply how a thing moved from one place to another. Naturally, the sun had one. By day, the sun god sailed the manjet, the boat of millions of years, across the body of Nut from east to west. And at evening, he passed the western horizon and entered the Duat. The Duat is usually translated as the underworld, but it is not quite an underworld and not quite an afterlife. It is a region, a dark country, with rivers and gates and caverns and inhabitants, through which the sun must travel each night in order to be reborn. It had geography. It had 12 hours, and each hour was a distinct place with its own name, its own gates, its own guardians, and its own population of beings who had to be addressed correctly. Egyptian priests mapped it in extraordinary detail. There are entire books of it painted on the walls of royal tombs. The Amduat, which means simply that which is in the Duat, walks through all 12 hours in sequence. The Book of Gates describes each gate and the serpent that guards it. The Book of Caverns moves through the deep hollows. These were not stories for entertainment. They were charts, and in the middle of the night, in the deepest hour, Something waits. Apep. The Greeks called him Apophis, an enormous serpent coiled in the darkness of the Duat. And he is the enemy of the sun, and he is there every night without exception. He is not a fallen god. He was never good and never part of the ordered world. He is what the ordered world is holding back. Every night the crew of the solar bark fought him. Set stood at the prow with a harpoon. Other gods held ropes and knives, and every night they defeated him, and cut him, and bound him. And every night he was whole again by the following evening, because he could not be finally killed. He could only be repelled again and again and again. The Egyptians found this reassuring rather than frightening, which tells you something about them. The threat was permanent, but so was the defense. The sun had come up every morning for as long as anyone could remember, and there was no reason to think it would stop, provided the rituals were performed and the words were spoken. In some temples, priests recited a text called the Book of Overthrowing Apep, in which wax figures of the serpent were named, spat upon, cut, and burned. The ritual was performed daily. It was maintenance. There were also sometimes moments when the fight seemed to go badly. A solar eclipse, a sudden darkening, a storm that blotted the sun at midday. Those were the days when the serpent had got closer than usual. The sun itself had 3 names, depending on the hour. At dawn, he was Khepri, the scarab, who is shown as a beetle rolling in the disk of the sun up over the eastern edge of the world. The Egyptians had watched dung beetles roll balls across the sand and had seen young beetles emerge from those balls, apparently out of nothing, and they took this as an image of self-creation and renewal. The word Khepri is related to a verb meaning to come into being. At midday, he was Ra, at the height of his strength, blazing above the desert. And in the evening, he was Atum, old, complete, sinking. The same Atum who had risen from the first waters at the beginning of everything. So the day was a life, and the night was a death, and the morning was a rebirth. And this happened once every 24 hours, visible to everybody, forever. Ra grew old. That is another story. and it is a surprisingly tender one. In the myth of the destruction of mankind, Ra has ruled the earth for a long time, and his bones have turned to silver, and his flesh to gold, and his hair to lapis lazuli. And he is tired, and people have begun to plot against him because he is weak. So he sends out his eye. The eye of Ra is a goddess. She is his daughter and his protector, and she is not gentle. She goes out as Sekhmet, the lioness, and she begins killing. And she is so effective and so delighted by it that she cannot be stopped. Ra changes his mind. He does not want humanity destroyed after all, but she will not listen to him. So he has 7,000 jars of beer brewed and dyed red with ochre until it looks like blood, and poured out across the fields at dawn. Sekhmet finds it and believes it is blood and drinks all of it and becomes too drunk to continue killing and falls asleep. And when she wakes, she is Hathor, gentle, and the danger has passed. Egyptians drank a great deal of beer at certain festivals in memory of this, deliberately and religiously. The story does not end there, and its ending is quiet and a little sad. Ra, having saved humanity and been disappointed by it, decides he no longer wishes to live among people. So he climbs onto the back of the celestial cow, and she rises, lifting him away, and the sky is set at a distance from the earth, and the gods withdraw from the world into the heights and the depths. That is the Egyptian version of a very old idea. There was a time when the gods walked around in the ordinary way, and then there was distance, and after the distance there were temples and rituals and priests, which are what you build. When a thing is no longer simply present, Ra had many names besides. A text painted in royal tombs called the Litany of Ra addresses him in dozens of separate forms, one after another, each with its own image, and the effect of reading it is of the same light being, described from 75 different angles by someone who cannot stop looking. Sekhmet and Hathor are, in a sense, two moods of the same power. Hathor is one of the oldest and most beloved goddesses in Egypt, and she is enormous in scope. She is love and music and dance and drunkenness and joy. She is a cow, or a woman with cow's horns holding a sun disk between them, or a woman with cow's ears. She is the goddess of the sycamore fig, and in tomb paintings she leans out of the branches of a sycamore at the edge of the desert to offer bread and water to the newly dead. She is called the Lady of the West, and the West is where the dead go, because that is where the sun goes. Her instrument is the sistrum, a metal rattle held in one hand and shaken, and the sound of it was thought to please the gods and to calm anger. Whole processions moved with the sound of hundreds of them. Thoth, we have already met, winning days from the moon. He was the god of writing, of counting, of measurement, of medicine, of magic, and of the moon itself. He appears as an ibis, a long-legged wading bird with a curved beak, and also as a baboon, seated, alert. Baboons scream at sunrise, and the Egyptians noticed this and concluded that baboons were greeting the sun and were therefore sacred. Thoth invented writing in the Egyptian account and gave it to humanity. He is the scribe of the gods. He records the outcome of the weighing of the heart. He is the one who knows the words. And in Egyptian religion, knowing the words was almost everything, because language had force. A name was not a label, but a piece of a thing's substance, and to know something's true name was to have real power over it. There is a story about exactly this. Isis wanted Ra's power, and she knew that the way to it was through his secret name, the name he had told no one. So she gathered dust from the ground where his spittle had fallen and mixed it with the earth, and formed a serpent from it, and set it on the path where he walked each day. The serpent bit him, and because it had been made partly out of his own substance, no god could cure it, and the poison burned in him. Isis came and offered to heal him. She said she could do it, but only if she knew his true name. He tried to put her off. He recited a long, magnificent list of his titles: the maker of heaven and earth, the one who opens his eyes and there is light, and none of it worked, because those were only titles. And in the end, in agony, he told her. She healed him, and she had his power, and Horus inherited it. That story tells you why Egyptians wrote names on everything, and why erasing a name from a monument was one of the worst things you could do to a person. To scratch out someone's name was to attack their existence after death. It happened. There are cartouches on temple walls that have been deliberately chiseled away. The Egyptians had a word for the force that made such things work. Heka. It is usually translated as magic, but that word carries the wrong flavor. Heka was not forbidden, not marginal, not opposed to religion. It was a substance, a kind of energy present in the world from the beginning, which the gods used to create, and which people could use if they knew how. There was a god named Heka who personified it, and he stood on the solar bark. Because the sun could not cross the night without him. Practically, this meant that spells were part of ordinary medicine. A doctor might set a bone and also recite. Neither part was considered the decorative one. There are objects that show how physical this was. Small stone tablets called sipi, carved with the child Horus standing on crocodiles, gripping snakes and scorpions in his fists, covered edge to edge in tiny protective text. Water was poured over the carved surface, running across the words, and then collected and drunk, or applied to a bite. The words came off the stone, into the water, and into the person. Magic as something you could pour. Fate had its own officials at a birth. 7 Hathors were said to appear and speak the child's destiny, and in one surviving tale they announce, at the cradle, exactly how the boy will die. Meskenet, goddess of the birth brick, was present at the delivery itself, since Egyptian women gave birth crouching on a pair of raised bricks. She was the personification of a person's allotted fate, and Renenutet, a cobra, was the goddess of nourishment and of the name given at birth, and she appears again at the weighing, standing near the scales. Your fate turned up at the beginning and was still in the room at the end. Egyptians also took dreams seriously enough to write manuals about them. A surviving papyrus lists dream after dream with a verdict beside each, good or bad, and an interpretation. And people traveled to certain temples specifically to sleep there overnight, in the hope of receiving a dream from the god, which a priest would then read for them. There were rooms set aside for it. You went to a holy place in order to lie down and close your eyes. A person in Egyptian thought was not one thing. They were several things gathered together, and death was the coming apart of them. There was the body itself, which mattered and had to be preserved. There was the car, the life force, the double, which was created at birth alongside you, and which needed food and drink after death. This is why tombs were supplied with bread and beer and cuts of meat, and why offerings continued for generations, and why tomb walls were painted with heaped tables of food, so that even if the actual offerings stopped, the painted ones would serve. There was the bar, which is closer to what we might call personality, and which was drawn as a bird with a human head. The bar could leave the tomb. It could fly out into the daylight and move about the world and return at night. The great collection of funerary spells that we call the Book of the Dead was called by Egyptians the Book of Coming Forth by Day. And coming forth by day is what the bay did, and the bar came back. That is the part that is easy to miss. It went out into the daylight, and it moved about, and then in the evening it returned to the tomb and settled onto the body again and rested there through the night. There are vignettes showing exactly this: a small human-headed bird hovering just above a mummy, coming down. The whole architecture of an Egyptian tomb assumes it. The burial chamber below, sealed. The chapel above, open, where the living came with bread and water and set into the wall of the chapel. A false door, carved to look like a door, but solid, with a doorway and a lintel and no opening at all, because the one who used it did not need one. The dead had a house and went out in the morning and came home at dusk. There was the ark, which is what you became if everything went well. A transfigured, effective, shining being among the stars. There was the wren, the name which had to survive, and there was the shadow, the shut, which was also part of you, and which was also protected. Mummification was the technology for holding some of this together. The process took 70 days. The internal organs were removed because they decay fastest and were dried separately in natron, a naturally occurring salt gathered from desert lakes. 4 of them were placed in 4 jars, watched over by the 4 sons of Horus, Imseti, with a human head, kept the liver, Happy, with a baboon's head, kept the lungs. Duamutef, jackal-headed, kept the stomach. Kebesenuef, falcon-headed, kept the intestines. The brain was removed and discarded. The Egyptians did not consider it important. The heart was left in place, and it was the one organ that could not be taken out, because the heart was where thought and memory and character lived. The heart was the person, and it was going to be needed later in a specific room, on a specific set of scales. The body was packed with natron and left to dry for around 40 days, then washed, oiled, resonated, and wrapped in linen, sometimes hundreds of square meters of it, laid in overlapping layers with small protective amulets tucked between them. Those amulets were not decoration. Each was a word, made solid, placed at the point where it was needed. The ankh, a loop above a crossbar, meaning life, held by gods in scene after scene, and extended toward the nose of the king. Life being offered as something you breathe. There was scepter, a straight staff with a forked foot and an angled animal head at the top, meaning dominion or well-being. In some scenes, there were staffs stand at the edges of the picture holding up the sign for sky, so that the world is a room with poles at the corners. The jed, the backbone for stability, placed at the throat or along the spine. The tayet, the knot of Isis, in red, for her protection. The wedjot eye, the one that was torn out and healed, for wholeness, laid over the incision in the flank, where the organs had been taken out, so that the wound in the body was covered by the image of a wound that had been repaired, and the scarab for becoming. The king's regalia carried the same logic. Osiris holds a crook and a flail crossed over his chest, the crook of a shepherd and the flail of a farmer, and every pharaoh was buried holding them in the same position. On his head, Osiris wears the atef, a tall white crown with an ostrich plume at either side, which must have been almost impossible to actually wear, and was never meant to be. At the head and the foot of the bier stood two women, Isis at one end, Nephthys at the other, arms raised, mourning. Nephthys is the quiet sister in this story, married to Set, but standing with Isis throughout, and it is she who helps search, and helps bind, and helps grieve. In some accounts, she is the mother of Anubis. The two of them are often shown, not as women, but as kites, the small falcons whose thin, high call sounds remarkably like keening. And professional mourning women at real funerals were called the two kites, and took their places at the two ends of the coffin. So, the funeral was a performance of the myth, with the dead person in the role of Osiris, and two women playing goddesses, and a priest in a jackal mask standing in for Anubis. And then, at the tomb, the mummy was stood upright, and a ritual was performed on it called the opening of the mouth. A priest touched the face of the mummy, or its coffin with an adze and other implements, at the mouth, at the eyes, at the ears, and by doing so, restored the senses, so that the dead could eat and speak and see and hear. Statues received the same ceremony because a statue without it was only stone. The implements used in that ceremony included an adze, and the blade of the ceremonial adze was ideally made of iron, not smelted iron, which Egypt did not have for most of its history, but iron that had fallen out of the sky, meteoric iron. Beads of it were being worked into jewelry thousands of years before anyone in the region was smelting ore, and the Egyptian term for it can be read as something close to iron of the sky. A dagger of meteoric iron was buried with Tutankhamun. So, the tool that reopened a dead person's mouth was made of metal. That had come down from the stars. Then came the journey. The dead person entered the Duat, which is the same dark country the sun crosses every night, and had to travel through it. And it was not safe. There were gates with guardians who demanded to be addressed by name. There were lakes of fire. There were beings with knives. And this is what the funerary texts were for. They were the answers. Spell after spell, telling you what to say, and to whom, and in what order. The oldest of them are the pyramid texts, carved into the walls of the burial chambers of pyramids, at the end of the Old Kingdom, beginning with the Pyramid of Unas. They are among the oldest religious writings that survive anywhere on earth. At that period, they were for the king alone. Later, in the Middle Kingdom, similar spells began appearing painted inside the wooden coffins of nobles and officials, and we call these the coffin texts, and their appearance marks something quietly enormous. The afterlife had widened. It was no longer only for the king. And later still, in the new kingdom, the spells were collected onto papyrus rolls and could be bought, and were placed in the coffins of anyone who could afford a copy. Some were made in advance with blank spaces, so the purchaser's name could be written in. Some of the obstacles are wonderfully specific. There is a ferryman, and he is turned away from you, and he will not take you across unless you can name him, and name his boat, and name the oars, and the mooring post, and the rope. Each part of the ferry has to be addressed correctly. There is a spell whose whole purpose is to get the ferryman to look at you. There are fishermen in the Duat who drag a net through the water, and the spells insist that the traveller must know the names of the net, and the floats, and the weights, in order not to be caught in it. There is a lake of fire, which is a place of destruction from one direction, and a source of light and cool water from another, depending entirely on who is approaching it. And running underneath all of it is a particular fear, named plainly in the texts, not the fear of dying. The fear of dying a second time. There are spells titled for not dying again in the realm of the dead, for not rotting, for not walking upside down, for not eating filth. The Egyptians had thought carefully about what could still go wrong after the worst thing had already happened, and they wrote protection against each of it. At the end of the journey came the hall of two truths, and there, in front of Osiris, seated, wrapped, holding the crook and the flail, the heart of the dead person was placed on one pan of a great balance, and on the other pan was a single feather, the feather of Ma'at. Ma'at is not exactly a goddess and not exactly a concept. She is both. She is truth, order, balance, justice, and the correct functioning of the world, all at once. And she is depicted as a woman with an ostrich feather on her head, or simply as the feather by itself. The pharaoh's entire job was described as upholding Ma'at, and every offering scene in every temple shows the king presenting Ma'at to the gods. Order was not automatic, it was maintained. Anubis, jackal-headed, god of embalming and of the necropolis, adjusted the balance. Jackals were associated with cemeteries for the simple and unpleasant reason that they were seen at the desert edges where the dead were buried, and so the Egyptians made the jackal the protector of the dead rather than their threat, which is a very Egyptian solution. Thoth stood by with a palette and reed pen to record the result, and crouched nearby, watching, was Amit. She had the head of a crocodile, the forepart of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus, which is to say, she was assembled entirely out of the three animals most likely to actually kill you in Egypt if the heart was heavy with wrongdoing. It was given to her, and she ate it, and the person ceased to exist, not punished, ended. Before the weighing, the dead recited what is usually called the negative confession before 42 assessor gods, each with a name, each associated with a place, and the confession is a list of things not done. I have not stolen. I have not killed. I have not lied. I have not taken milk from the mouths of children. I have not stopped water in its season. I have not caught fish with bait made of fish of their own kind. There were 42 of these assessors because Egypt was administratively divided into something close to 42 districts, which the Greeks called nomes, each with its own capital and its own local god. So, the tribunal of the dead was assembled the way a national council of the living would have been, one representative from each province, and the dead person had to answer to all of them by name. They are oddly specific, and they are quietly moving because they show you what these people thought mattered. Do not dam a canal at the time when others need it. Do not add weight to the scales in the market. Do not turn away a stranger. And there was a small hedge built into the system, which is very human. A hot scarab was placed on the chest of the mummy, a large stone beetle, and inscribed on it was a spell addressed to the heart itself, asking it not to stand up and testify against its owner in the hall. Do not oppose me before the keeper of the balance. They wanted to pass. They knew they might not. Those who did pass went out into the field of reeds. And here is where you might expect something extraordinary. A palace of gold, a city in the clouds. But the Egyptians, who had one of the most elaborate afterlife theologies in human history, imagined paradise as Egypt, a perfect Egypt, fields of barley and emmer wheat growing taller than a person, canals full of clean water, palms, a house, family, the same river, running quietly through the same reeds, forever, without famine, without failure of the flood. They loved their country so much that heaven was a version of it where nothing went wrong. There was work to do in the field of reeds, since fields need tending. And so the Egyptians solved that too. Small figures called shabtis were placed in the tomb, sometimes one, sometimes hundreds, occasionally 365, one for each day of the year, with overseers to organize them. They were inscribed with a spell saying that if the dead person is called upon to do any labor, the shabti will answer, "Here I am," and go instead. They were mummiform, holding tiny hoes and baskets, and they are found in their thousands in museums. Small blue-green figures standing in rows, still waiting to be called. The blue-green came from faience, a glazed paste of ground quartz that fires to the color of shallow water and glazed pottery. The Egyptians called the material something close to dazzling, and they used it for amulets and beads and bowls and tiles, because that particular shifting blue-green was the color of the river and of new growth and of the sky, which is to say, the color of things coming back. Let us come back up out of the duat, into the daylight, and walk through the ordinary religion of ordinary people, because the gods of the great temples were not always the gods of the house. Most Egyptians never entered a temple sanctuary. The inner rooms were for priests. What the public saw was the outside and the great festivals, when the god's image was carried out in a portable bark on the shoulders of priests, veiled and processed between temples. Two of those festivals are worth sitting with. At Thebes, once a year, the Opet festival carried Amun from his temple. At Karnak, to the temple at Luxor, a little under 2 miles upriver, in a gilded bark shrine on the shoulders of priests, with crowds along the route and music, and the smell of incense and bread being handed out. Then, after some weeks, the god came home again, and there was the beautiful festival of the valley, which is one of the gentlest ideas any culture has had about the dead. Once a year, the image of Amun crossed the Nile to the western bank, where the tombs were, and the living crossed with it, Families went out to the tombs of their own dead, carrying food and wine and bouquets, and they cleaned the chapels and lit lamps and ate a meal there in the presence of their parents and grandparents. They stayed overnight. The lamps burned in the tomb chapels all along the cliffs, and in the morning everyone went home. Inside, the daily ritual was intimate and domestic. Each morning the sanctuary was opened, the seal on the doors broken, and the statue of the god was greeted, washed, anointed with oils, dressed in fresh linen, presented with food, and given cosmetics. In the evening, the doors were closed and sealed again. The god was being cared for the way you would care for a person every day. For centuries, the sanctuary floor of many temples rises slightly as you move inward, and the ceiling lowers, and the light dims, so that the innermost room is small and dark and slightly raised. It is the primeval mound. Every temple is the first island rising out of the first water, rebuilt in stone, and the great columned halls that stand between the entrance and that inner room are marshes. The columns are carved as bundles of papyrus stalks tied with cord, or as lotus stems, and their capitals open at the top into papyrus umbels and lotus blooms. The lowest parts of the walls are decorated with marsh plants. The ceiling overhead is painted deep blue and covered with stars, and sometimes with the long body of nut. So you walk in from the daylight through a stone reed bed under a night sky toward an island in the dark. The building is not decorated with the world. The building is the world. Most temples had a sacred lake beside them, rectangular, stone-lined, fed by groundwater, where priests bathed before the rituals. Several are still there, still holding water. The writing on those walls the Egyptians called Medu Neter, the words of the god. The Greeks translated the idea as sacred carving, and that is where our word hieroglyph comes from. And because the signs were pictures of real things, and because a name or an image could carry force, there are tombs where the hieroglyphs have been deliberately made safe. Snakes drawn, cut in two, birds and lions carved without their legs. The scribe was worried that the words themselves might get up in the dark of a sealed chamber, and took precautions. Some gods were not images, but living animals. At Memphis a single bull was recognized as Apis, identified by a precise set of markings, and he lived in the temple precinct, was consulted as an oracle, and when he died was mummified and buried in an enormous granite sarcophagus in an underground gallery. And the search began for the calf who was next. His mother was honored too, and buried nearby. The scale of animal offering in later periods is difficult to picture. Ibises were mummified for Thoth in vast numbers, and stacked in jars in underground galleries, hundreds of thousands of them, perhaps millions. Cats for Bastet, falcons for Horus, crocodiles for Sobek, including very small ones. A pilgrim visiting a shrine could buy a mummified animal and dedicate it the way a person might light a candle. There was Wepwawet, another canine god, often confused with Anubis but distinct, whose name means opener of the ways. His standard was carried at the front of processions, going ahead, clearing the road. He opened the way for the king in life and for the dead in the duat. And there was Nefertam, who is the blue lotus itself, shown as a young man with a lotus flower on his head. He was said to be the flower at the nose of Ra, the scent the sun god breathes, and he is the god of perfume and of the moment of opening at dawn. In the home, people turned to different gods. Bes, above all, Bes is unlike any other Egyptian deity in appearance. He is a dwarf, shown from the front rather than in profile, which almost nothing else in Egyptian art is, with a broad face, a lion's mane, his tongue sticking out. He is not dignified, and he was not supposed to be. He was a household protector, and he guarded women in childbirth, and children, and sleep. His image was carved on beds. It was carved on headrests, the curved wooden supports Egyptians slept on. He was there to frighten away the things that come in the night. And he did it with noise and ugliness and knives, and by looking directly at you. There were probably more images of Bes in ordinary Egyptian homes than of any of the great state gods. Beside him, Taweret, a hippopotamus standing upright, pregnant, with the limbs of a lioness and the back and tail of a crocodile, and she is entirely benevolent. Hippopotamuses are dangerous animals and fiercely protective mothers, and Taweret is that protectiveness turned toward human mothers and infants. She appears on amulets, on wands of carved ivory, on furniture, on jars of milk. There was Bastet, the cat, whose great festival at Bubastis was described by Herodotus as the largest and most joyful in Egypt, with boats full of people singing and clapping their way up the river. There was Khnum, ram-headed, who sat at a potter's wheel and shaped human beings out of Nile clay, forming each child and its car together before birth. There was Heket, a frog, who assisted at birth, because after the inundation, the fields filled with frogs, and their sudden appearance meant new life. There was Serket, the scorpion goddess, invoked against stings and bites, which in a country of scorpions and snakes was a daily, practical concern. There was Sobek, the crocodile, feared and honoured at once, with his own city and his own sacred pools, where crocodiles were kept and fed and adorned with jewellery. There was Neith, very ancient, a weaver and a huntress, and one of the deities the other gods wrote to for advice. There was Ptah of Memphis, a craftsman god, shown wrapped in a tight shroud holding a staff, patron of builders and sculptors and metal workers, whose high priest carried the title greatest of the directors of craftsmen. This is the third creation account, the one promised earlier. The Memphite version says that Ptah did not rise from the water and did not emerge from an egg and did not create with his hands. He conceived each thing in his heart and named it with his tongue, and by being conceived and named, it existed. Thought, then speech, then the thing itself. Everything the priests of Heliopolis credited to Atum. This text says Ptah had already made by thinking it. That is a remarkably abstract idea to find written down that long ago, and its survival is a small accident. The text is known from a single slab of black granite, and at some point in the intervening centuries, that slab was taken and used as a millstone and turned, and the grinding wore the middle of the inscription away. What we can read is what happened to lie outside the circle. His temple gave the country its name, the great sanctuary. At Memphis was called the house of the car of Ptah, and Greek visitors reproduced that phrase as something close to Aegyptos, and from there it becomes Egypt. The Egyptians themselves never used it. They called their land the Black Land, after the soil. There was Min, ancient and unmistakable, god of fertility and of the eastern desert roads, whose harvest festival involved the king cutting the first sheaf of grain with a sickle while the god's image watched from a canopy. There was Sokar, a falcon god of the Memphite cemeteries, older and stranger than most. His sacred boat was not sailed but dragged. At his festival, the shrine was hauled around the walls. In the dark, before dawn, and onions were worn around the neck, and the procession moved slowly in lamplight while it was still night. And there was Amun, the hidden one. His name means something like concealed, and he began as a minor deity of the air at Thebes and rose over centuries to become the most powerful god in Egypt, merged with the sun as Amun-Ra, with a temple complex at Karnak so vast that it took 2,000 years to finish, and remains one of the largest religious buildings ever constructed. Its great hall has 134 columns, and the largest of them are so thick that it would take several people with arms outstretched to encircle one. For a brief period, all of this was interrupted. A pharaoh we call Akhenaten closed the temples of the other gods, moved the capital to a new city in the desert, and elevated a single deity, the Aten, the visible disk of the sun itself, shown as a disk with rays that end in small human hands. It lasted less than 2 decades. After his death, the old gods came back. The new city was abandoned, and his name was struck from the king lists. The Nile itself had a god. Hapi, shown as a plump figure with hanging breasts and a belly, blue or green, crowned with river plants. Neither male nor female, exactly but abundant. He was not the river as water. He was the flood, the annual arrival of it. Everything depended on that flood. Too little, and there was famine. Too much, and villages washed away. And its timing was announced by a star. Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, which the Egyptians called Sopdet, disappears from view for about 70 days each year, lost in the glare of the sun, and then, at the height of summer, it reappears just before dawn on the eastern horizon. Briefly, low, before the sunrise erases it. That first reappearance is called the heliacal rising, And in ancient Egypt, it happened at almost exactly the moment the Nile began to rise. So, the year began there, a star returning from 70 days of invisibility, immediately followed by water returning to the land. And 70 days is also, as it happens, the length of the mummification process, so that the dead spent as long in preparation as the star spent in the underworld before coming back. The year they built around it had 3 seasons, not 4, and each of them was 4 months long, and each was named for what the river was doing. Akhet, the inundation, when the water came and the fields vanished, and the villages stood on their small islands. Pere, the emergence, when the water drew back, and the black land reappeared, and everything was planted. And Shimu, the low water, the harvest, the dry time before it all began again. Not spring and summer and autumn and winter, flood and emergence and harvest, a calendar with a river in it. At various points along the Nile, they cut nilometers, staircases and shafts descending into the water, with measurements marked up the wall, so that the height of the flood could be read exactly and recorded, and the size of the coming harvest estimated, and the taxes set accordingly. Religion and administration were the same activity. The Egyptians divided the night sky into 36 groups of stars called decans, each rising in turn, so that the passage of the hours could be read directly off the sky. Tables of them are painted on coffin lids, so the dead could keep track of time. And the stars that never set, the ones that circle the pole and never dip below the horizon, they called the imperishable stars. They do not die. They simply turn. Some of the oldest pyramid texts express the wish that the dead king would join them and become one of them, wheeling above the world without end. There is one more bird to mention, the Bennu, a heron, standing on a stone, and it was said to have alighted on the primeval mound at the very beginning, and its cry was the first sound. It is associated with rebirth and with the sun, and with cycles of enormous length. Greek writers, hearing about it, described a bird that burns and is reborn from its own ashes, and gave us the phoenix. The Egyptian version is quieter. It is simply a grey heron, standing very still at the edge of the water at dawn, which anyone who has been on the Nile at first light will have seen. And when Greek rulers came to Egypt and stayed, the gods absorbed them too. A new deity was assembled, Serapis, with the beard and robes and hair of a Greek god, and the underworld role of Osiris, and the bull of Apis inside his name, deliberately designed so that two populations could worship the same figure, without either feeling it belonged to the other. It worked. He got a great temple at Alexandria and a following that spread for centuries. Even then, the pattern held. Egypt did not replace, it added. The word the Egyptians used for a god was Netja, and they wrote it with a picture of a cloth wound around, a pole and standing upright, a banner of the kind that was planted at the entrance to a shrine. So, the written sign for a god is a flag in front of a holy place, visible from a distance, moving in the wind. And every morning, when the sun came up, the baboons on the eastern cliffs screamed at it, and the priests in the temples sang to it, and the words of those hymns survive. They are simple. They say, "You rise," and it is beautiful, and the two lands are in festival, and everyone wakes, and everyone stands up on their feet, and the birds are flying, and their wings are praising you. That is much of it, though not all of it. It never is all of it. There are local gods in every town, festival calendars, hymns, spells for headaches and childbirth and scorpion stings, dream interpretation manuals, oracles, and thousands of stories we know only from a broken line on a fragment of pot, but the shape of it holds a mound rising from still water, air holding the sky off the earth, a boat crossing and crossing back, a serpent held off for another night, a feather and a heart and a pair of scales, and beyond it, a green country very much like this one, where the barley grows tall and the canals are full. And now the sun has gone down over the western cliffs. The temple doors are sealed for the night. The last priest has gone, the bolt drawn, the clay pressed and stamped. In the dark of the sanctuary, the god rests among linen and oil and the faint smell of incense. Outside, the river is quiet. The heat has gone out of the stone. Along the banks, the reeds move a little, then settle. Somewhere, a heron shifts on one leg and grows still again. In the houses, The lamps are low. Children sleep on woven mats. Beside them, carved into the wooden headrests, the small, ugly face of Bess keeps watch, tongue out, eyes open, guarding the dark. The fields lie flat and black under the stars. The canals hold the sky. Palms stand motionless against it. And beneath the world, the boat is moving through the first hour and the second, through gates that open and close, past the coils in the deep water where the harpoons are already raised. The crew works quietly. They have done this before. Above them, the body of Nut curves across everything, dark and scattered with gold. The imperishable stars turn slowly around their point in the north, as they always have, as they always will. The river runs on toward the sea. Cool air moves along the water. Somewhere far ahead, at the eastern edge of the world, the horizon is beginning to think about light. A scarab pushing something upward through the dark reads against the current. Water and silence, and the slow turning of the sky. Nothing hurried, nothing ending, only the long night and the boat and the coming morning. Rest now.